Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of the Snapshot. We are your hosts. My name is Brendan Patrick, and I'm joined by none other than KMBest. The Snapshot is a Marvel Snap podcast focused on the competitive side of the game. Episode 3 is all about the different types of decks in Marvel Snap. Believe it or not, there's actually more to deck building than just Zabu and Leader. We'll be going over decks like Discard, Lockjaw, Deathwave, and many more. So without further ado, here's episode 3 of the Snapshot. KM, good to have you back. How are you doing, sir? How was your week in Marvel Snap?
I love the pause we put there. Like, how was your week in Marvel Snap? Because I do the same pause, right? Like, I do the same. I'm going to talk about my week in Marvel Snap. I don't know where that comes from.
It's called
I definitely do it.
A pause for effect, sir.
I don't know what effect it's having is kind of what I'm getting at. I don't know if it's actually conveying anything. My week in Marvel Snap was honestly a little more saddening than I would expect. I learned two things. One is that there are maybe 2 or 3 free-to-play decks I haven't tried. And to be clear, I am hopeful for something like Patriot. Yeah, I think Patriot's a good deck. It's not like, you know, the funnest thing in the world to play. I am hopeful that it is possible to climb with Patriot, but I can tell you right now that like a lot of the old free-to-play standouts, Ongoing Destroyer, Sarah, they are subpar right now. Or not necessarily subpar. They're not like unplayable. It's just like instead of being something that, let's say, a Snap fan would have at a 60% win rate, they have at a 55, right? It's not like they're unplayable. It's just that there are better options now. And I think there is nothing that encapsulates this more than Ongoing Destroyer, which was the sort of typical disruptive deck that still put points on the board. It would win games off the power of Cosmo and Armor, but it would also win games off of just putting points on the board. And now the deck that does that is Silver Surfer. And it has not only supplanted the role that Ongoing Destroyer had in the metagame, it has supplanted the role that the other Sarah decks used to have in the metagame. Like, it is a dangerous deck. I think at any given time, it is one of the 3 best choices you could possibly make to play this game. And it will probably remain as such. As far as Zabu, I do think he's very powerful. I don't think he's like the biggest, baddest thing you can possibly be doing. I think he's definitely up there with cards like Silver Surfer, with decks like that, especially at endgame when people have access to cards like Darkhawk and Shuri. But I think the fundamental thing I learned about Zabu is I don't enjoy playing Zabu decks. Yeah, that's what I learned. I don't enjoy it. I like a deck where I can just play like a normal game of Marvel Snap most games.
Yeah.
I don't like having, you know, like I'm running America Chavez, so I can like do my overpowered thing 54% of the time, and then 46% of the time I like really struggle and like don't have fun at all. That's not ideal in my opinion. But that said, it's a very powerful thing to do. It's strong, and there's still plenty of unexplored space in the archetype.
It feels like with Zabu, you have a very linear path towards a winning game and a very linear path towards a losing game. And like you said, it doesn't feel like there's much in between. And that can lead to an experience that is less enjoyable depending on the player you are, right? I think in Marvel Snap, you can actually be rewarded for decks like that because it's clear win to snap and it's clear win to retreat. But if your games are just kind of this light switch or on and off, it leaves out the nuance of kind of what gives this card game essence, at least for me. So I feel the same way. I have been having fun with Zabu, but the games where I am not able to do my thing and I just play 4 drop on turn 4, 4 drop on turn 5, and maybe 4 drop on turn 6, I'm like, oh my God, this feels terrible.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like I get that I'm spewing cube equity by liking the things that I like. But I loved that just the Shuri deck where it was just like, yeah, we're going to play a card on like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then we're going to move those cards around and see if we can make our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 curve win the game. I just like that. I like being able to do the thing the deck does a bunch, even if it spews cube equity. Because I do lose out on snap equity. Like, you know, I don't have like a super overpowered, I'm going to snap before I do this into Zabu or whatever. But it's, I don't know. I generally, like, obviously I'm still enjoying the game. I'm still playing it a ton. I'm still having a blast playing it. But weirdly, the deck, and this is going to sound ridiculous when I talk about, like, how on rails the Zabu decks are. When I tell you the deck I've been having the most fun with is Galactus.
Yes,
Because
sir.
at least, like Galactus, okay, sure, it's on rails, but it's extremely fun when it's on rails. You know what I mean? And it does such extremely cool things. It leads you to these extremely fun checkmate scenarios. You never have good cube equity, but it is extremely, extremely cool every time.
That segues perfectly into my week in Marvel Snap because I had a ton of fun on Alter, the hot location, or I think it was the featured location, that actually incentivized you to play Galactus decks. I had so much freaking fun. Actually, I got to use my Null card, which I bought the day it released, but has been sitting in my collection doing nothing up until now. I don't know that. I think that location in particular was a bit. It did feel a bit pay to winny, right? It kind of felt like the best decks were playing a lot of Series 5 cards. So, it could be clouding my judgment on how much fun I had. But being able to play Galactus, I genuinely enjoyed that. Being able to play Null, Doc Ock was really fun on that location. So I actually had a good time on Alter. How about you?
That deck I played on Alter, the Galactus Null deck, I actually think it's just good, straight up. I think when you're not on Alter, maybe you're supposed to run Wave instead of Psylocke. You can go like Galactus into Doc Ock on 4/5. But I'm not 100% sure yet, because the downside of ramping your opponent when you're not doing that really sucks. I will say, I worry that we're becoming out of touch, right? Because like we're here, like, you know what I hate? You know what I hate? I hate playing this pay to win card. And I love playing this other pay to win card. My most hated thing is pay to win card A, but my least hated thing is pay to win card B plus C.
B plus C indeed. Yeah, I mean, like we talked about this on last week's episode, sort of the converging metagame with some of these Zabu decks and how a lot of them run things like Shuri and Darkhawk. It's a bit overwhelming for sure, because with the current card acquisition model, players' engagement with Series 5 cards is kind of disgusting, to be honest. And hopefully it does get a rework. Genuinely hoping for that. But I want to go ahead and hop into the news, because speaking of Series 5 and Series 4, I actually have a question for you in regards to battle mode, which we got a lot more news on. But first, on January 10th, we did see Sauron released. I just want to get your thoughts on the card. It's a 3 resource, 3 power card. I think it's 0 power. That reads, on reveal, remove all abilities from ongoing cards in your hand and in your deck. So this has clear synergy with cards like Typhoid Mary, Red Skull. It technically helps Lizard, but you don't really want to be playing that card late after turn 3. I guess it's decent with Titania potentially, because it's a 1 resource card you can play later. And I think it's
Ebony Maw.
Ebony Maw, indeed. Yeah, and it seems like a natural slot into the 0 deck. Of course, it's just an expansion of that synergy, of that archetype. Do you think that this unlocks that deck? Is it going to be no. Yeah, playable?
This card's cost 6,000 tokens. It doesn't unlock anything for anybody. There are like going to be 20 people who have this card. Like it maybe when it downgrades, it'll really actually affect the metagame. But as is, what it does is it makes a good deck better for people who are willing to pay 6,000 tokens for it.
Assuming
it's definitely, if you like love Zero Shuri, this goes in there. It's good in there.
Yeah. So let's assume it was a Series 3 card. Do you think does it make a good deck better, or does it make a good deck? Does it make a good deck great, though? Do you think that deck could be like a viable sort of A tier on par with
it's hard.
Silver Surfer?
That deck's a good example of like when we talk about what is aggro in Marvel Snap, because when we talk about what is aggro in Marvel Snap, I think that deck is aggro, right? Maybe it's a little combo, however you want to phrase it, but that deck is a deck that loses to your opponent's Shang-Chi. And that's kind of it. It puts a really big number out there and then is like, do you have the interaction to beat me?
Yeah.
It's like however you want to call that. It dictates the terms and then says, you know what, if you have the stuff that beats me, then you have the stuff that beats me. Fine, whatever. And there's, I think that's pretty dope. I usually enjoy playing decks like that in card games, decks that ask questions rather than decks that demand or have the answers, right? But I think that's actually a pretty good deck. I think it is a deck that I would play if I had Sauron. He's currently pinned in my token shop. He is 3,100 tokens away. We were in the middle of talking about Sauron, and we noticed that the video feed was flipped. So instead of being in the token shop, we were in the Pas Nakat.
Pas Nakat.
So we were just seeing where everything was backwards. We fixed it though. Given our technological genius and prowess, we were in the middle of talking about Sauron, who I think is, it's a card that goes into that archetype. Honestly, the only thing I don't like about that archetype is it plays Arnim Zola, but you have to play Arnim Zola. I'm just a big ol' Arnim Zola hater. Like it's not even like a competitive thing. I'm just an Arnim Zola hater. I'm a hater.
I love playing Arrow against a clear Arnim Zola turn 6.
It loses to like everything. It's like, oh well, but like you need the Arnim Zola, right? In order to have the pin of Arnim Zola and the Taskmaster, right? They can choose to play around one, but they can't choose to play around both. And it's like, okay, fine, I get it. But boy, do I hate like, oh, well, they have priority. Here's an armor. There goes my deck. Like, I hate it so much.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of these bundles that came up this week. There's the Primal Masterpiece bundle, which is mostly cosmetic. Pretty bad value if you're looking for credits, and obviously no collector tokens. I don't know who would buy it in the right mind. If you are watching on YouTube, you can see that it is currently sold in my shop. There is also a pro.
I can't believe you actually bought that. That's kind of crazy.
Yeah. All right. So there's also a pro bundle, which is not in my shop for the reason that it was sold, which is just raw credits. It was actually technically I think it was plus EV if you're just going to buy credits every single day. But I was obviously not necessary.
It's plus EV if you were ever going to spend $100 on the game.
Yep. And there is the added benefit that it does make you an official pro in Marvel Snap by title. So that's a big bonus. And, everybody kind of watch out. I do have that acquired at this point. But yeah, a couple bundles. Don't really need to pick them up. Nothing necessary. Would like to see more bundles in the future with these with collector tokens, because that's kind of sort of the main currency for people that are fully acquired in Pool 3. But yeah, we'll see.
On the subject of currency and bundles, it's almost certainly optimal to wait until January 1st to spend anything, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, they're doing the downgrade at the end of the month. And so whenever that downgrade comes through, that's probably when I'm going to be spending the rest of my tokens. Or my credits, which sucks because, like I said, I have Sauron pinned in my shop. There's a decent chance I just get really bored and spend the rest of my credits to just get the card now, which I know is a terrible idea, but there's a decent chance it happens. Yeah,
I mean, you can definitely have some serious buyer's remorse of the Series 5 cards. I did with Null, but recouped it in the altar location. Let's talk about battle mode, KM, because we got some additional information about this coming out very, very soon. It is going to be a one-on-one mode, of course, but you will have 10 health, which you'll be wagering. It's not the same as cubes. Your health just goes down. You can't really gain health, so it's a limited resource at that. So there's this issue that we talked about last week of you being, on theoretically, if there was this 10 cube format, you're on 1 cube, but then you snap to 8 cubes. That's not going to be an issue because you can't belt more health than you have. My question for you and Cam is, in terms of battle mode, if there's some community grassroots tournaments, do you think those tournaments will limit players to only Pool 3 cards?
Christ, I have no idea. That is a very tough question, and I do not envy tournament organizers trying to parse this situation. I wouldn't be shocked if there were like, all right, no cards from the last month kind of thing. Normally I'd be like, that sucks, but now with the cards costing what they do, I think it just kind of has to be what it is, right? Or no Series 5 cards other than Thanos and Galactus kind of thing. Like, if you really want to bring those decks, you can. But I mean, that is weird.
Yeah, I think that it could be okay to have the competitive tournament meta be Series 3 based, right, and then have cards rotate in off of downgrades, maybe including Series 4 as well. I think that of course you would probably add in the season pass cards ideally, because those are somewhat acquirable. I know they do come in at Series 5 after the pass is done, but we could see somewhat of a microcosm of a format, right, to adjust so the players can participate with more integrity, right? But that's coming up. It's very, very exciting. I think that if there is anything to be excited about in Marvel Snap right now, I think it's battle mode. I think it completely changes the landscape of the current game and unlocks this next level of end game, which we don't really have right now. Because currently in Snap, you hit infinite, and it's just like this void, this ether of you can keep going, but it doesn't really do anything.
No, dude, you could play 5 hours a day in the event for a title.
Oh my god!
Doesn't that sound exciting?
Oh.
Doesn't it sound exciting to play 5 hours a day in the event for a title that you can't even access on Steam, that most people don't know is a thing that's happening right now? But if you're finding out about it from this podcast, sorry, you're already too late, because you can only do a certain amount of points every day, and there are going to be people doing the full cap every day. So if you missed one day, sorry, don't even bother anymore.
Yes, and
isn't that fun?
You also probably have to be infinite unless you want to put in an egregious amount of time, because if you're infinite, you can just snap every game with somewhat immunity, right? It's pretty silly. The whole event thing, I mean, we can get into this at a later time, but their whole event thing has been like a flop like every time for me. I also think that how you engage with it, you can't engage with it on Steam. You have to go into the news, then you go into this other tab.
I don't understand why the events don't work on Steam.
Yeah.
Like that is like, when we talk about things that are just like actually unforgivable, that is like no balance problem even comes close to me. No matter how much I hate playing Zabu decks, like that's not necessarily foreseeable. It's hard to understand, how metagames evolve. Card design is difficult. I get it. Why can't I interact with events on Steam? Why is the news tab still broken? Someone needs to explain that to me in a way that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I can't show it on the screen right now, but I also think that it borderline doesn't work on mobile either, because when you go into it, not only does it take multiple tabs to get there, but it runs at like 5 FPS. The graphics look like they were transported from 1990 or something. It's super bizarre.
I really don't get it. Like, isn't it just a web page? Why can't I view a web page in your client?
Yeah, I have no idea. I hope they overhaul it, because events could be a cool way to incentivize players to do something interesting week to week. But right now, that system feels very bare bones and just almost like it's, I don't know, it's just like this part of the game that people don't really engage with, to be honest, in like a small subset.
Yeah, when I brought the event up in Twitch chat, the number one question I got was, what event?
Yeah, what are you talking about? All right, KM. Let's head into our listener question of the week, the bend and snap, as we like to call it. This week's question is from Kevin Obis. He says, "Hey guys, question for the show. The most recent round of nerfs has me asking, should Second Dinner consider some sort of compensation for nerfed cards like Hearthstone does? HS gives full dust / crafting currency refund for nerfed cards. If you don't know, I don't think we'll ever get 1,000 tokens per card that gets nerfed, but it sucks to spend your also rare tokens in the shop and then see a card nerfed later, as happened to me with both Arrow and Leader." Your thoughts, Cam?
No, I don't think they should do that. I can see the argument, and it does suck. But the last thing I want is for their balance team to feel like they have a financial obligation to not make changes. That is something I do not want to put the desire of the company to make money in conflict with balance. I just don't want to do that. Because, like, call me a cynic, but if you ask me, the desire to make money will win out every single time. Even if it doesn't happen on a large scale or a small scale, I just don't want those interests conflicting. Mm-hmm. I want Second Dinner's interest in the metagame to be, is this fun? That's it. I don't want them to have to think like, damn, we can't nerf Zabu. That card costs $10. I do not want that. I don't want them thinking, damn, we can't nerf Silver Surfer. That card costs $10. I think they already put themselves in that position in a way I really don't like, because the two cards for me that define this metagame are Zabu and Silver Surfer. And it's like, okay, if you nerf those when they hit Series 4, everyone's just going to be like, what? So the pay-to-win players got to play them for 2 months, and then we have to play the bad versions? And like, that's already putting them in a position where they are incentivized not to make changes for the purposes of, I guess, PR or not having people get mad at them online. And like, I just don't want that to happen. Mm-hmm. I want them to fix problems where they show up. I don't care if they nerf the card I just spent 6,000 tokens on, if it's actually a problem. If I had spent 6,000 tokens on Silver Surfer right now and they nerfed it, I'd be like, You know what? That's fair. you probably were that was probably the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And I especially because like, this person spent 1,000 tokens on leader, and it's like, every time I've said anything about, if you want to buy leader, yeah, it's good advice, but they might nerf it. And the reason I'm telling you it's a good card worth buying is because it's strong enough to get nerfed. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Like, you're gonna run that risk if you're buying only extremely powerful things from the shop. Yeah, sometimes they're gonna get nerfed. Like, that's just how it is. And frankly, I don't think the nerfs did anything to Arrow and Leader. I think their fall off has been much more related to metagame things than nerfs. They're the exact same cards they've always been. Leader especially, I think, is actually a little underrated right now. It's just that if you're not playing Zabu, you're not ever going to be in what I like to call leader range. Like the range where leader wins the game. If they're playing like Darkhawk and stuff, your leader's not really going to do much. But it does seem like a really compelling card in a lot of spots right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I empathize with the player, like the sort of bad beats when you save up your currency, buy this card, and it does get nerfed. I would argue or probably suspect that second dinners actually, like you said, already in that scenario where they are financially motivated around balance, mm-hmm. with specifically, right, the season pass cards. Like Zabu comes out, is freaking busted. We can't, if they nerf it into the ground, like you KMBest, the streamer, the person that plays all the time, the person that plays the high ranks, you might be like, yeah, that's good for the game, right? That's going to make my play experience better. But for the casual player that bought that in the season pass for $10 and is maybe mostly motivated at beating their opponents, not a good game experience, they'll be like, this is terrible, right? And yeah. So there are that it's a tough scenario. I think that they could add it in. Like, I think it's a possible. Maybe it's not 100% refund, but maybe something to help players feel a little bit better. Ultimately, we'll see, right? I think the player feedback will probably be pretty negative once they do nerf a prolific card into the ground, and people will be a bit louder about trying to get to that refund, but we'll see. Anyway, Cam, I want to hop into the main topic here, which is archetypes in Marvel Snap. All right, Cam, so let's go ahead and hop into the main topic of the pod, which is going to be archetypes in Marvel Snap. We're going to start from the macro archetypes, things that exist in other card games. This is kind of the 4 pillars, right? Aggro, control, mid-range, and combo. But then we're going to go ahead and drill down into some specific deck lists, because Marvel Snap actually has a lot of different ways to play the game in full pool 3. Mostly synergistic build rounds of specific cards, but you have these other sub-archetypes of like discard and things like that, and we're going to go ahead and kind of take a deeper look into all that. But let's start with the macro, because it doesn't translate 100% one-to-one to Marvel Snap. So aggro in Snap is not really aggro. My best way of describing it, I think, is kind of like Flood, right? So I would look at decks like Zoo, right? The decks that put on a bunch of 1-drops generally are filling most spaces on the board and then have some sort of buffing aspect. Usually, we talked about the Zero deck as being a version of aggro. I was also thinking potentially something like Patriot. What are your thoughts on aggro in Snap, Cam?
I think aggro is the archetype that translates the least from Snap to other games, because people think of aggro. Aggro involves, in other games, you get down early, you start attacking your opponent. In Snap, this tends to, obviously you can't attack your opponent, right? And also the fact that there are 3 locations means that, getting down early isn't always the advantage that you think it is, because it gives your opponent the information about your possible range of points on those locations. So aggro tends to mean in Snap just you're putting a lot of points on the board and you don't really have a theory as to how you're going to win the game other than you're putting a lot of points on the board. Like, that's kind of the thing you do, is just points. And the skill of that is just allocating them at the right spots on the board, playing around various locations. And what you're not doing is really interacting in any way. You're not really interacting beyond the base level of interaction built into Snap by the location system. So Patriot would be a good example of this. Zoo would be a good example of this. Sarah, I think, would not. Sarah back in the beta, Sarah used to be a deck that did this, but now Sarah is a Shang-Chi Enchantress deck, much more than it is any kind of aggro deck. It's much more reactive, interactive, using the fact that it can play more cards on turn 6 than you in order to react to the threats you present on the board.
Yeah, likely not going to see those tech cards that find their way into Sarah decks in what you would consider to be a traditional aggro list or maybe a flood based list, kind of a more Marvel Snap native term. Let's go.
This is the one that maps the least onto Marvel Snap. Yeah. Patriot, I think, is the best example, but even Patriot is a little bit of a combo / synergy aggro list. You know what I mean? Patriot is like, to use a Magic the Gathering analogy, it would be the Tempered Steel deck, right? Like you're doing a very specific thing for a very specific buff, right? Is that an aggro deck? Yeah, it's a synergy aggro deck, sure.
Yeah. So the first thing that popped into my mind was something like Affinity or something like that, where you have, all of these cards kind of have the same subtext where they have no context to get buffed from Patriot, and Patriot is your synergistic sort of build around there that's buffing all of those cards. So next up is Control. Control translating into Marvel Snap. I'm thinking about a better word for Control in Snap is probably Disruption, reactive, whatever you want to call it. Plays a lot of cards like Cosmo, like, potentially Debris, Storm, Jessica Jones. Like, I think that Control and Snap is more based around cards than it is around like a macro strategy. I guess the macro strategy would be Disruption, right? You're reacting to the opponent, you're interacting with your opponent is doing on the board, and your strategy changes dynamically based off what you expect them to play. Cam, what are your thoughts on Control?
I think this conflates two distinct styles of Control. So like something like a Storm, Spider-Man, Doctor Doom location control deck, right? That's one style of control. The other style of control would be we are going to wait until the very last turn of the game to play Shang-Chi and Enchantress on your big guys kind of control. Those are two completely different decks. One is a sort of proactive control deck that costs you cube equity for guaranteed wins, and the other is a reactive control deck that looks for high cube equity situations on the final turn of the game when stakes double. Mm-hmm. These are completely different archetypes, in my opinion, actually.
Yeah. And I would think that Control, more than any other archetype we speak about, interacts with the locations as well, is either by manipulating them or playing towards them, trying to taking, I guess, more agency over the potential locations that pop up than the opponent and exploiting that to its advantage.
I don't know if it's true. Like, the archetypal control list in Marvel Snap evolved out of the beta. It was a deck that played Magic on turn 6 in order to get extra turns in the game. And basically just then go play like Shang-Chi, Enchantress, Killmonger, Cosmo, you're dead, right? And that was like the archetypal control list, and then it sort of evolved and diverged into versions of that playing Storm and Doctor Doom, things like that. I think that control means two things, and most people will think of one of those two things. They'll think of Storm or they'll think of Shang-Chi. Right. Mm-hmm. And that's a really distinct. Those are two distinct archetypes. There's reactive control and then there's location control. And so like when you look at, say, the Spider-Man, Absorber Man, Zabu decks, those are proactive control. Sometimes they have overlap with reactive control, right? Because like you also have Enchantress and Shang-Chi in there that Absorbing Man can copy too, right? That's like a hybrid between the two. Yeah.
Yeah.
But for the most part, these have remained relatively distinct archetypes.
Mm-hmm. And you could, if you wanted to just lump it into proactive and reactive control, Storm is probably an aspect of proactive control where things like Shang-Chi are just pure reactive. So that's kind of a good distinct sort of line in between the two differing sub-archetypes there. Let's talk about mid-range. So mid-range is pretty well defined for me for the decks that have dominated at least the meta before Zabu, but also the Zabu meta. So this is the good stuff decks. And I have a list pulled up here, which is sort of the Zabu list I'm playing, but the Zabu leader decks seem like a good example of mid-range, right? Their mid-range tends to go for value, right?
I mean, I also think, what would be a good example of a mid-range deck is Sarah Surfer, right? Like they have this interaction in the form of cards like Polaris, Cosmo, Killmonger. They have all this interaction that also gets used as part of their big points game plan with Silver Surfer, right? It's not something unique to just good stuff deck, right? It's also There are synergy-based mid-range decks like Silver Surfer, or to a lesser extent, Ongoing Destroyer. I would classify as one of these decks. And these are, they have been a part of the game basically the entire time. It's just the good cards decks had a big moment last season because Silver Surfer decks weren't fully refined and Zabu wasn't out yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I just want to be clear, like mid-range to me just means decks that both interact and put a ton of points on the board. You know, like they do both things. They occupy both spaces, and they are able to fluidly switch roles between being a reactive deck and being a proactive deck.
Yeah. And so to finally round it off, that leaves us with combo. So I think that there's some easy first decks to think of when you want to talk about combo and snap. So I would think the Hazmat the Hazmat Luke Cage deck, almost anything that's with Wong, right? This like Wongo combo where you're just trying to either play whether it's a White Tiger and Iron Hearts or, you know, of course, a Silver Surfer as well. Usually the way I think about combo decks is they tend to be centered around one or two cards that are key to the strategy, right? It wants to do that sort of one or two specific things. And outside of that, its cards don't work very well together. What are some examples of combo and snap for you?
Ghost Rider, Lady Sif decks, I think, come to mind. Like that's like a very both of those cards have been nerfed. In the beta, Lady Sif cost 2 and Ghost Rider cost 3, so that was super cool. You used to just run them in Sarah with America Chavez, so you drew Sarah more, and it'd just be like you're vomiting a million points and more accurately drawing the cards you need. It was great. It was a very, very cool thing that they did. In terms of combo, pure combo is likely just like those Wong decks, right? Mm-hmm. Or like there are a bunch of like ridiculously bad Wong decks, or like the Omega Red combo decks. Like those are combo decks. Those are true combo decks in the sense of like you're gonna probably not win a ton of games, but when you do win those games, you're gonna win by like 1 million. And you might think I'm exaggerating, but I'm pretty sure the Omega Red deck actually can win by like 1 million. I do question, like, what is Lockjaw? Is the Lockjaw deck a combo deck, or is it just like an engine deck? Did you like draw your Panharmonicon or whatever? Like, I don't know if that's a combo deck or just a deck that defies my ability to categorize it.
Yeah, it does feel combo-esque because I guess if you just don't draw your engine, that the rest of the list just tends to suck like really bad. But I don't know. What about Hela? I think that Hela is quite a kind of a quintessential combo deck for me.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, like this very high risk combo deck where you're discarding these big cards that you pretty much have no intention of playing, and the whole time you're trying to not discard Hela, and Hela is just going to overwhelm the board if you're actually able to play it.
I like how you're like trying to not discard Hela, like it's a thing you can try to do.
You're willing it. You're willing it.
You're trying really hard.
Yeah. So I would say in conclusion, like in Snap, these archetypes are kind of much less defined than in other games, and decks tend to be a hodgepodge of multiple archetypes. And I think that, you know, any of these decks can kind of technically play any card. It's not like we have these segments between colors like you would in something like Magic the Gathering. So because of that, like you could find an aggro deck, I mean like a zoo deck, and this wouldn't make much sense, but a zoo deck could play Storm, right? They could play Storm, and like a player could just think that's a good thing to do, right? They're gonna, you know, because they're going to be buffing cards on the flooded thing. So because of that, in Marvel Snap, everything flows a bit more, and decks can kind of be multiple archetypes. All right, so now that we've sort of broken down the macro archetypes of Marvel Snap, we're going to go ahead and talk about synergy decks, like these build-around decks that we've been referring to all throughout this podcast. We're going to go ahead and show you, if you're watching on YouTube, there'll be a bunch of deck lists popping up on the screen, so you can check those out if you're interested. But synergy decks and build-around cards, these decks are often named around the key card they're built around, so Patriot is a perfect example. We're going to hit a lot of them, but we won't hit all of them, so I'll have some honorable mentions at the end. And I think that these are these decks are a perfect example of how deep Marvel Snap gameplay and deck building is. Although, if you listen to this podcast, sometimes you hear us talk a lot about Zabu and about leader, but there's actually so many different ways to interface with the game. And this should be a good example of that. So first off, Cam, I want to start with Patriot here. Patriot, general strategy and key lines. So Patriot's playing a lot of cards that have no text, so they will have this flavor text on them. I have Shocker pulled up here. And the reason why it plays all those cards, these cards that are you don't see in pretty much any other list, is because Patriot buffs them. And generally looking to play Patriot, you're looking to play Mystique to copy the Patriot and potentially play something like an Onslaught to just double those effects as well. Top end could look something like Ultron, right, to sort of flood the board in a gotcha or surprise kind of way. Cam, do you want to talk a little bit about this deck in terms of how you feel about it in general, its pros and its cons, and maybe its current viability? You mentioned at the top of the show that you think that this is a potential deck to play at higher ranks if you don't want to be doing the Zabu leader thing.
Well, I do want to be clear. The version of Patriot that I would be playing does not involve either the card Magic or Wave, and probably doesn't involve Onslaught either. But basically, I just think it's a very solid deck with the current featured location, and even without the current hot location, it is, it's fine. It does its thing. It's a pretty predictable deck, but what it does is put points on the board, and that's maybe good enough. I've noticed that both of the stats websites, Snap.fan and MarvelSnap.pro, both seem to think highly of it. I don't know how much of that is just, it's very easy to build Patriot once you get into Pool 3, and so you're playing it against people who do not have full collections. I'm looking into it right now, basically, but I do know that, I have lost to it, so that's not nothing. I have lost to this deck. I don't lose to it all the time, but I have, and, that's worth investigating, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would say... Easy Pro, right, is the easiest pro for me is it is good against leader. This deck is genuinely good against leader. Leader does not do much against turn 6 Patriot play.
Yeah. You play the Patriot earlier, right? Mm-hmm. Against the leader decks, you're playing the Patriot earlier because then you'll play Ultron or whatever. And your Ultron will absolutely nuke the board, while their Ultron will make a bunch of 1/1s. And it's that's one way to break leader symmetry.
Yeah, and the cons being that it's just predictable, right? And you can find ways to potentially disrupt the Patriot and the follow up Mystique.
Enchantress. Enchantress is bad.
Yes, Enchantress is.
That's the con of this deck is Enchantress exists.
Mm-hmm. All right, so next up is a deck I know you're very fond of, which is Sarah. So this is, I think I pulled this list from you. This is your Sarah list. Some people I know have gone a bit heavier on
this. Is not my Sarah list.
Oh, it's not. Yeah. Okay, so it does. This Sarah list.
You can tell it's not mine because it runs Storm.
Storm, yeah. So I know that Sarah Surfer seemed to be a bit synonymous at this point. The introduction of Silver Surfer seemed to fit a bit. Seemed to slot quite well into the Sarah deck. The Sarah deck, the general line is, you're trying to get some equity in the early game, play Sarah, and flood the board, right? So Sarah's discounting everything by 1 cost. This deck can be okay against leader, speaking of decks that are good against leader, because of how Silver Surfer is going to buff the cards you developed before turn 6. That being said, if you don't have priority, it is quite unfortunate when you do play that Silver Surfer, buff some of the cards you played on turn 6, and your opponent gets the buff cards plus an additional Silver Surfer buff. But I'm going to let you take it away on Sarah, because this is I know this is a favorite of yours.
General strategy / key lines. All right, hear me out. This might sound crazy, but you play a 3-drop on turn 3, and then a 3-drop on turn 4, and then you play Sarah, and then you play 3 3-drops on turn 6. Whoa! No, I joke. But I actually don't joke. That is what you want to do.
That is
that is exactly the thing you want to do.
Yeah.
And for the record, I wanted to bring up why I don't like Storm in these lists, because it makes your 3 and 4 extremely predictable. What? You're going to go Storm into Brood and blow your Brood on a Storm lane that you're probably already winning? That's ridiculous, right? I think Storm was one of the early traps that this list fell into, where it's just why would we not run Storm Juggernaut in here? But the answer is because you can threaten all 3 lanes. You don't need to steal a lane. You don't need to do that. You don't need to invest turn 3 and turn 4 into stealing one lane when you can threaten any lane. Like, one thing I think people don't think enough about in Marvel Snap is the more of your opponent's cards you invalidate, like the harder your opponent is invested in a lane that you win, the better it is for you. And Storm is a signal to just not invest in a lane. Like, and so you're investing in this lane, but they're investing in the other lanes, and suddenly you're behind in the other 2 lanes, right? And that's not good. And Surfer especially is a deck that absolutely can punish people for this, right? Like, they invest heavily in a lane and you go like, haha, it's Brood. And they're like, ah, shit, we lose that lane. And that's really good. Like, I don't really know. I don't think that concept gets talked about enough, but winning lanes your opponent has invested in is a big way to win games in Marvel Snap.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Sarah playline on turn 4, 5, 6. It can be a bit straightforward, right? But I do think that my favorite part about playing the Sarah deck is that you can play a lot of toolbox cards. You can play things like Killmonger, Polaris, and of course, if you want to play Storm Juggernaut, you have Cosmo available. That makes it so you are playing this flood-oriented deck, maybe what you would consider to potentially be an aggro deck, but you have all these reactive tools to interact with your opponent and disrupt them, and that makes the deck feel very rewarding to play, in my opinion.
It's good.
Yeah.
It's like, honestly, the analogy, here's a Magic analogy for all the boomers out there. This is like Call Blade. It might like it. Maybe it's like Call Go, where it's just like you're always in every game, and you're also doing this overpowered thing at the end. Like, people think of this as an aggro deck, and it's actually an interactive deck with an aggro finish. I don't know. It just kind of does everything, and that is, it is. I think at any given time, it's the safest deck to play into an open field.
Yeah. Do you think this deck is tier 1? Do you think it's one of the top decks?
Oh yeah.
I agree with you. All right. Next up, we have one of my least favorite decks in Marvel Snap, but an interesting way to play the game, and that is the Lockjaw deck. So Lockjaw is completely centered around this card being Lockjaw.
Can we get like casino music playing in the background for this? Like, can we get like the sound of a slot machine, or like no? I want. Do you know when you're playing Mario Kart and it's just like you get one of the items and it just like flashes over your head before it decides what item you get? That's the music I want playing right here.
You know, I think my final evolution as a Marvel Snap player will be I will purely be a Lockjaw Hella player. Just rolling those dice. But as KM has alluded to, this deck is quite high variance. You pretty much need to draw the namesake card because the rest of the deck virtually doesn't function without it. It's playing a lot of top end. These cards you can see is American Chavez, Dr. Doom, Magneto, Infinite. It's pulling those out of the deck with Lockjaw by playing Sunspot, Wasp, some of these lower end cards. We'll play the things like Thor because you can get multiple triggers on the hammer to buff, and of course place a card like Jubilee because you're going to have so much of that just useless top end in your deck anyway. You might as well Yoikoing out with Jubilee here. Have you played any Lockjaw, Cam?
Yeah, I played it on like the last hot location, and I gained like 10 ranks. I was like, wait, why am I gaining ranks with this pile? I mean, granted, the last location was extremely good for Lockjaw. The one before Altar of Death, where we were just, I don't remember what it was like Morag. It was the hot location, the 24-hour one. The most recent one was just like, well, I'm just gonna play a bunch of big idiots like Vision and Doctor Doom, and it's gonna be fine. And then it was fine, and in a way that like I really have no explanation for. I think the deck might actually be underrated.
Yeah,
it kind of does stuff.
You know who
like,
loves
there's
this deck?
Something to be said for just like playing like, I don't know, playing like Thor into Jubilee into Vision into Doctor Doom. That probably gets there a bunch, right? Like, I don't know if it gets there all the time, but it's not nothing.
There's a couple of decks that I always see Den talk about. Den is a content creator associated with Marvel Snap Zone and has been in the TCG sort of space for a long time, or CCG, whatever you want to call it. But Lockjaw, Dracula is definitely one of his favorite decks.
Oh God, he loves Lockjacula.
Yeah,
so which that's what he used to call it until someone pointed out what that sounds like. But he's always been a Lockjacula evangelist.
Yeah, that and bounce. So yeah, pros. Pros are, I guess, sometimes there's not much your opponent can do. You can high roll the living crap out of them, and the cons are high variance, and you don't have a lot of agency over your gameplay. It doesn't feel like, but for some people, that's a pro. I'd say current viability. I mean, it's viable, but it's probably underrated, and I think that KM and I are not the players to go to when it comes to being like, how good is Lockjaw? Because we will probably default to this deck sucks, no matter how good it is.
No, I don't think it sucks. I don't think it sucks. I think it might, like, honestly, honest to God, it might be the best pool 3 only deck. That's an indictment of the rest of pool 3 only decks, but like it honestly might be.
So it's not that
I think tells you how desperate I've gotten.
Yeah, it's not that I think it sucks. I think I just have a predisposition to dislike the deck, and because of that, I probably underrate it. I probably don't play it enough. All right. Let's go to the next one here, which is actually one of my favorite decks to play, even though it's not super viable, and that's Infinite Discard. This deck is fun. I
love it.
Yes.
I always want it to be viable, but like my relationship with Discard is, do you know that scene in Arrested Development where Tobias is trying to convince his wife that they should maybe give it one more shot? And she goes, has that ever worked for anybody? And he goes, no, but it might work for us. That's how I feel with this card every single time. I have never, like, every time I'm like, I'm never playing this card again. And then someone posts a list that's like one card different from the thing I hated playing. And I'm like, okay, let's do it.
So this list in particular that I have up is it's probably the most consistent, or one of the most consistent I've seen, and it has a bit of nuance to it, in the sense that you're not playing your swarm until turn 6. You're trying to discard your swarm as much as possible. Obviously, discard your Apocalypse as much as possible, and you want your Dracula to copy that Apocalypse on turn 6. You're also playing American Chavez out of hand, and it's decently consistent, right? There's not a lot of bad beat discards out of the deck. Your Lady Sif is hitting the card you want it to hit pretty much every single time, while your Colleen Wing is almost 100% of the time discarding your swarm and guaranteeing you the multiple copies. This is the deck that I go to after I hit Infinite, and I'm looking to just kind of hang out and have fun. Pros are that...
Does it ever work? I'm going to ask you the questions on this one.
Does it ever work?
I want to know. Does it ever work? Like, can you climb ranks with this deck?
Yeah, I think you can. I mean, so last season I played it in Infinite, and I think I climbed like 50 cubes, just hanging out, just having fun, and just messing around with the deck. I think that it fades in terms of consistency compared to things like the Zabu decks, right? The Silver Surfer decks. Like, you can discard your Dracula, and that sucks. You cannot draw your Dracula, and that sucks. This deck really wants to play Dracula on 4, and that's probably the highest variance part about it, to be honest. Like,
my follow-up is, can we put Zabu in here?
Can we put Zabu in here? Maybe. I haven't tried it. I haven't played this deck since last season.
Yeah, that's kind of like, what other 4s does this deck even want to play is the issue.
Yeah. I'm not too sure off the top of my head. I'll have to revisit it. But I know some players, like this list I got specifically, I can't remember the player that I got it from, but they posted an entire article about they climbed all the way to Infinite with this specific list. And the guide they wrote actually helped a lot, because I think there's some play lines that you wouldn't immediately recognize.
I would be curious to know what their collection level was at the time that they did this.
Well, they have Dracula, so... I mean,
right, but like you have there, this is like a deck that you can build once you get like a little bit into pool 3. It's just Dracula, Colleen Wing, and so like I do sort of wonder what impact that may have. But I have no, like, the matchmaking is so opaque to me that whenever I see a deck that I'm just like, that sucks, I always question the collection level, and that's probably not fair to the people that I do it to. But like, I always wonder, because it's like, like, especially a deck that has like only a couple of pool 3 cards, it's like you could be like collection level 600 right now. You know what I mean? And like, you might not be seeing anyone who has like endgame stuff. I don't know. Maybe they are. Maybe they're not. I always have to wonder, because like if you're not like collection level 1 billion, I can't be sure that you're actually seeing the stuff that like I'd be afraid of. Basically, I can't be sure your experience would map onto mine.
Yeah. I mean,
And that's also true the other way. Like, if someone's listening to this and they're like, why is he focused so much on Darkhawk? I've never seen that card in my entire life. Yeah, that's why.
yeah. I mean, I would say if you're looking to play a discard list, I have a lot of faith in this one specifically. If you want to play that archetype, and I recommend you give it I recommend you give it a shot because it is fun, right? And
God, you know, it might work for me. I'm doing it again. I'm talking about something like I've played this exact list and been like, I hate it. I swear, but I'm going to do it again. I'm do it again.
All right. Well, speaking of fun decks, let's head on to another fan favorite of both of ours, which is Galactus. I love this deck. I hate it sometimes because it does feel a bit high variance, I guess. But I freaking love this deck. I think I'm showing my list that is pretty similar to the one that I played on Altar. But like we talked about this on the show. Dr. Octopus is so freaking fun to play with. It is hilarious to Galactus people that are not expecting it. And Null is an awesome card if 99% of the meta isn't playing freaking leader. But I love this deck. I think that some of its pros are, even though Psylocke and Psylocke Electro, they might kind of hint at this Galactus play when you leave a lane open and people can arrow you when you try to Galactus on 5. You're still going to get a lot of people. A lot of people will be like, damn, they'll forget about the Galactus. You'll totally blow them out. And that is a great experience. What are your thoughts on it?
So the issue with this deck is you're like never ever winning more than 2 cubes unless your opponents are really dumb. But I think sometimes like the idea that like, oh, well, I'll beat a Null or whatever, right? I do think it's very funny that they nerfed Galactus and Leader, but kept it so that Leader beats Galactus in the heads up. Which means that a lot of the time, if you expect a Leader, your play is to go Shang-Chi into death rather than playing Null. But I don't know. I enjoy playing this deck because it lets me put enormous numbers on the board. That's pretty much it. I get to be like, I get to watch the Galactus animation and hear his like the dubstep sound of him blowing up the world. And then I get to play an enormously large idiot. And that's kind of, I love that. I'm a big fan of that in Marvel Snap.
Yeah. Okay. Next up, let's go to Mr. Negative, or Bass Negative, as I kind of have it now. This is pretty close to the deck list. I don't know if I snagged this from you, but I remember when Bass came out.
I do not play Magic.
Yeah. Well, you were having an absolute meltdown when Bass first came out, and you were just yoinking cubes from people. I remember being in the stream at that time. You were absolutely dominating people with a Mr. Negative Bass list. This list since then has obviously fallen off for me. But I still think that it's a very unique way to play Marvel Snap. You do kind of have to draw the namesake card, but Mr. Negative is a pretty unique effect. If you didn't play in beta, it will be relatively fresh to you. I think I didn't play in beta, but from what I understand, he was a tyrant. So
the deck is quite powerful. I think really what it's missing right now is better ways of interacting. So, like, if you ask me specifically, like, I tend to prefer the Sarah Surfer decks over this, just traditional Sarah Surfer, even though this has a much higher power ceiling. And that's almost entirely down to the fact that those decks get to play Cosmo. Like, getting to play Cosmo is the biggest deal in the world. Like, it's one of the strongest cards in Marvel Snap. It gets to do this sort of reactive / proactive play style. It's weird because people think the decks are the same. They couldn't be more different. This deck is all about maximizing point values, right? That's what it does. It does point values. Sarah Surfer interacts. Polaris, Cosmo, Killmonger. It's doing things to interact with your opponent's board. And this deck, outside of maybe a rogue, is not doing that. This is if we go back to the archetype discussion, aggro combo. Mm-hmm. All it does is points. That's it. That's the whole thing this deck does. And I remember I actually had a conversation about this recently with Vin Kelsier of SnapFan, who was the originator, I guess, of this archetype. Wrote about it before Bast came out, was talking about how this would be the deck once Bast dropped, as soon as it dropped. The stream you remember, I was playing his list, and he's like, yeah, I basically agree with you that losing Cosmo is like really, really bad. he did not agree with me that losing Killmonger was as bad as I thought it was. But like, I think just sort of fundamentally, I tend to prefer the other list a little bit more, which is not to say this list is bad at all. It's probably got an extremely high cube equity, because you are able to compete in most of the games you play. You have a bunch of redundancy. I do think it's important to note that I think Sarah is bad in this list. I think the list you have up is pretty old. Blue Marvel, Magic, and Sarah are not cards I would play right now. You need to be able to actually play the cards in your deck. And so you end up leaning much more towards a Silver Surfer type game plan. So you have like Silver Surfer, you have Brood, you do things like that. And that I think Bishop might also be a little bit iffy in the deck, but he is a 3/1. I've seen Vin run Morph specifically so that he could play him for free on turn 6 after a Mr. Negative. I don't know about that, but he's always been more into Morph than I have been. The main thing, I do think this deck is not the list that's on screen right now, or at least the list I'm looking at, is not what I would play. I would not recommend it in any real way, but there are plenty of solid builds out there that cap out at like just Mr. Negative and Iron Man as your 4 and your 5, and everything else is cheaper, and you're hybridizing with Surfer. But generally speaking, I prefer the interactive Surfer decks to the ones that are purely trying to interact based on point placement.
Yeah. I played this deck a little bit, but I didn't have as good results. I also played the version that you were playing back on Bass release. But let's go ahead and head into Deathwave, because this is, in my opinion, this is a fantastic Marvel Snap deck. It just unfortunately suffers from leader. So
everything. It suffers from everything. It suffers from Zabu, it suffers from leader, it suffers from everything, dude.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So now that Zabu's a thing, I mean, I used to think that this was my favorite deck before the kind of Darrigan good stuff leader deck was just 90+% of ladder. This was my favorite deck to play, or specifically the Barrow list.
You just call him Darrigan?
Sorry, what did I say? It
Darrigan.
Darrigan. I mean, that's a reasonable thing to say.
No, it's like calling me KMBest.
KMBest. I mean, that we could move on. That could be a good nickname. Yeah, Dara JN. Yeah, before his list got popularized and leader was everywhere, it was one of my favorite lists in Snap. I thought She-Hulk was a great addition to that, but it does feel like it's just fallen behind, right, in terms of its viability.
It's not even bad. It's still a fine deck. I think it's pretty good even. It's just not the force it used to be. It's a shame. I do think the build that I'm looking at is correct to cut Arrow here. In the context of Zabu, Arrow is way worse, right?
Yeah.
The reason Arrow was so good in Deathwave was because you could know they were only playing like one card, and that means you could always safely arrow it out of the lanes you wanted it to be in. But now it's Zabu, and they're playing like 3, and suddenly you're like, oh shit, I actually can't guarantee that Arrow's going to win this game. It does make leader a lot stronger, and that does in turn make you kind of not want America Chavez, because you do want to be able to draw the leader in those matchups, and she does make you a little less likely to do that, while in exchange making you more likely to draw Wave plus She-Hulk. It's just a question of which one of those you prioritize. It's just, if you're relying that heavily on leader, maybe you want to be a different deck.
Makes sense. All right, let's just hit the honorable mentions here, because we've taken quite a bit of time going through these lists. So I'm just going to say for the honorable mentions, I guess, are Ongoing Destroyer, Devil Dino, which is obviously centered around the namesake card, Thanos, a deck I hope to play more.
Thanos is actually good. I swear to God, Thanos is actually good. It's just no one's going to buy Thanos. That deck is actually good. I would not be surprised if it was better than something like Deathwave or Ongoing Destroyer generally. It just kind of is, right? It does stuff, and no one really... One of the major advantages of it is no one has any idea what its range is at any given time. Like, you know what you're doing, but they have no idea if you're, like, going to draw 8 cards, or, like, play a Blue Marvel, or, like, play a Devil Dinosaur. No one knows.
There's, so one of my biggest critiques of Snap, just as a personal player, like my personal issue, right? Or just one thing that's lacking for me is the best way I can draw a parallel to is in Flesh and Blood, there's a deck, there's a hero called Kano. It's the wizard hero, and it's centered around drawing a lot of cards, deck manipulation. It's combo oriented, and it's more, I guess it's complex in a sense, but it plays a bit of a solitaire game plan, which is not.
It's blue.
Yes, it's blue. And Thanos feels like a deck sort of like that, where I can invest into it. I'm playing with my deck, right? I'm drawing a lot of cards. I'm manipulating my deck, et cetera, et cetera. And I actually feel like Thanos is extremely unique in Marvel Snap because no other deck feels like that to me. Yep. I don't think it's the final form of that kind of play style in this game, but it's the first iteration and it feels great. And yeah, Thanos is a deck that I just hope to get a lot more reps on in the future because it gives you that sort of relationship with your deck. You're drawing tons of cards. You're manipulating sort of what's in your deck, what's not, and it feels great. All right,
it's great fun and probably better than people think it is.
My last mentions are Zoo, Move, and KMBest's favorite deck, Agatha. No, Agatha is obviously a meme. I know that every YouTube thumbnail you see will beg to differ, telling you it's the most broken Agatha deck that exists. But
Agatha is busted.
Agatha's busted, farming cubes. Classic. All right, that concludes our main tech of the pod, which was Archetypes in Marvel Snap, which had to show you all a lot of deck lists, a lot of synergy deck lists, or synergy decks, things that are built around specific cards or strategies. And hopefully we displayed that there's just many different ways to interact with the game. There's many different ways to build your deck and to play a game of Marvel Snap. I know that the higher ranks have felt like they've converged onto, a more value-oriented gameplay, or playing these cost reduction cards like Zabu, or top-end cards like Arrow and Leader. But there really is so many different options in this game. So hopefully we've displayed some of that today. To close that out, Cam, we do, since we're a new podcast, reviews mean a lot. So if you are enjoying the podcast, let us know. We do have a sort of a URL or a lander for all reviews. It's called Rate This Podcast. So if you go to ratethispodcast.com/snapshot, it's going to be a review aggregator that will sort of detect whatever you're on, whether it's desktop or iOS, and just make it one click easy to leave a review. And that leads us into our next section, which is going to be at the end of pods, which is reading out a new review on the week. Just want to let you know that if you do want to get your review read out, funnier the better. Feel free to poke fun at us and make a little joke. So this week's review, not on the funny side, but a very nice review at that. It's from EB, and they say, stoked to see Brendan come out with a new podcast for this game too. I'm excited to see what you guys have coming next. So sounds like
it's important to note. I think it's important to note that Brendan is the one who picks these outros, so the nicer you are to him, the more likely he is to pick your outro to the podcast.
Oh, you say that, but I've had some serious burns on the Arsenal Pass podcast, and people love to go at me on the.
Look, I'm just saying it's not a coincidence that the first review he reads out is one that's like, yo, Brendan, you're so cool.
It's the only review, actually. That's the best I could do. But yeah, get us some funny ones so we can laugh a bit harder in the outro here. But yeah, ratethispodcast.com/the snapshot. Helps out a lot. So there is a video version of this podcast on YouTube. If you are listening on a pod platform, we're at around 400 to 500 subscribers right now. If you could subscribe, that would help us out a ton. We're trying to get it to 1,000 subscribers. And I'm not just going to be like a traditional YouTuber asking you to subscribe without giving you anything in return. I come bearing gifts. And what those gifts are is once we hit 1,000 subscribers, we will unlock YouTube chapters. So what are chapters? Chapters are when you look at a YouTube video and it's broken out into all those segments. So you'll see on the other Snapshot episodes, I've gone and written out all the different segments, but they're not coded into the video. And we have to hit 1K subscribers until that is unlocked on YouTube. So if you want to be able to skip past certain sections, skip to the outro, hear the funny comment at me, just get us to 1K subscribers and we'll have chapters unlocked. So yeah, that's youtube.com/@the_snapshot. We're on Twitter. I'm at Brendan APG. KM is at KMBestMS. And Cam, why don't you go ahead and plug your Twitch and we'll sign off.
Actually, KMBest Miz. I think that's how that's pronounced.
Oh my God. I'm never gonna live this down.
I'm pretty sure.
KMBest News and Brendan Abj.
Yeah.
Brendan
Abja. Yeah. My Twitch, also KMBest MS. I stream daily at this point. I don't know why I'm saying at this point. I've streamed daily for like the last 3 months. It still feels new to you when you stream because like, you know, I have an 8-hour workday and then a 4-hour stream. And so like you never get any time to like decompress and actually take stock of where you are. You're just going and going and going. And if you'd like to see a man go and go and go until he eventually spirals into a complete meltdown of like, imagine Scrooge McDuck diving into the gold coins, but with cubes. That's kind of where I'm at with this. But no, all seriousness, I am endeavoring to create content that helps you get better at Marvel Snap, to help you be a better player, to help you, and like in maybe the slightest way, be like a little better at, you know, handling the worst aspects of playing card games that you care about. So I try to work on that too, because it's stuff that I have to work on. But mostly I think people follow me because I play game good and give deck lists to help you play game good too. I think that would be my guess at the majority of the appeal. I can't really tell. It's like I said, I've never taken any time to take stock and decompress because I have been so grateful for the support I've received. You just sort of keep going, you keep pushing, and it's just like until I'll just keep going. Basically, I'm the Energizer Bunny of Marvel Snap. I'm just there every day,
Awesome.
Same time, 6 p.m. weekdays, usually about 3 to 4 p.m. weekends.
We'll check it out. That concludes episode 3 of the Snapshot. Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you want to get your comment read out on the Bend and Snap section, just shoot that in the YouTube comments, and we'll get one set up for episode 4 next week. But until next time, we'll see you in the next episode.